if I don't necessarily reject Christ, which I don't, but if I just live my life as what I like to think of as a pretty good man, and I do have principles that align with the values of Christianity, and I try to help people and contribute to my community and be a good father eventually and a good husband, then would that be sufficient?
No.
All right, Cliffe and Stuart were on the Iced Coffee Hour with Graham Stephan, and their question about hell is absolutely amazing. He's like, I've been a good person. I didn't know much about God. I didn't reject him. Will I still go to heaven or go to hell? And when Cliffe says no, it shocked him completely. It's absolutely amazing. So make sure to watch this end because this is super special and such an amazing opportunity. So let's go.
About hell. Like, how is hell depicted? Because that, for me, is a very interesting one. It sounds illogical, or at least not intuitive, that someone can exist not well for a life that's maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years long, and sin and not ask for forgiveness, and then for eternity be banished to hell. What is hell depicted like? What is the general understanding?
Well, sin doesn't send you to hell. It's what you do with Jesus Christ. What do you do with God? Are you going to live for yourself? So David Foster Wallace, you guys probably know him. He wrote Infinite Jest, was probably going to be the greatest writer of our era. Atheist, he said, everybody worships something. If it's something that is ultimately infinite, it can buoy you in a way where you can make it through suffering. But if it's something that is like looks, talent, money, that's all going to fade away. And eventually it'll eat you alive. And so he pointed to a type of heaven and hell he ultimately didn't believe, but he said it makes a lot of sense. And so for us, we say all these kids on college campuses, back to your question a second ago, these kids on college campuses believe in a heaven and hell typically, and there's a growing belief in hell specifically because they want justice. Justice is intimately connected with hell, infinitely. Because if you don't have hell, there's no judgment day, and ultimately endless amounts of people are going to be ripped off, and there's no justice from a moral, objective perspective either if there is no God.
So what's the primary judgment then? Basically, like you said, if you believed in Christ.
Yeah, if you decide I'm going to give up myself to gain myself, if I'm going to live for something outside of myself and say, I'm going to humble myself in order to say, God, I want to live for you rather than me. Now you're moving in that direction versus living for something else.
I agree. That's probably a moral statement to live for something more than just yourself. So I agree with that. But you could also live for your children. You could live for the community, other things that sure the text would support. But technically, if you're also morally not living for yourself, you're doing something just, and therefore you probably, should get into the gates, right?
Well, again, it's what do you do with Jesus Christ? Because if you live for children or if you live for community, I mean, if one of my kids dies and I'm living for them and I turn them into God, I'm going to have an existential breakdown. Jordan Peterson talks about that. You guys had him on your show. Mm-hmm. He flat out said that. If I'm living for a parent or a kid, I will have an emotional, existential, total breakdown, and I will be depressed significantly the rest of my life if I turn them into a God, rather than something that is infinite and personal. Endless amounts of people say this. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. He said people were literally shriveling up and dying, or they were becoming tremendously selfish if they did not believe in a God outside of the prisoner of war camps.
Wow.
So if you live for something that's finite, it's going to destroy you eventually.
But why do they need to live for Jesus in particular and not maybe another God?
Mm-hmm.
For like any other religion out there, would they go to hell?
Right. And so the question becomes, who are we to judge hearts? We are not universalists in saying that any religion, it doesn't matter what you are, you're going to heaven if you follow it sincerely. No, it's not about how sincere your belief is. It's about the object of your faith. And is there evidence for the reliability of that object or not? Is it just...
Yeah, and I know Cliffe is going to say, just because you have faith doesn't mean that it's the right religion. All of these religions have truth factors, truth claims, but that doesn't make it right. That doesn't mean they're right. Because if one of them is true, then the rest are wrong, and that's a problem. They get stuck on this. But I love that they're having this conversation. It makes me so happy.
No, I'm going to be sincere. This is my religion that I grew up in, and that's what I'm going to follow. Versus the evidence for, no. Every single person, like he just said, every single person is going to ask those big questions at some point. Leo Tolstoy, when he was at the very apex of his writing career, everybody knew him in the world. had an existential breakdown because he said, wow, I'm going to die one day, and all these books that I'm writing, all this money that I'm accruing, doesn't really matter whatsoever. So he has this breakdown. So the question becomes, back to my dad's original point, who or what is more reliable than Jesus Christ and who you're living for? So you have to do your research, but we don't believe that if you don't have just the knowledge, God's going to send you to hell. So it's not just a knowledge thing. It's how do you live out your life as well? Am I living in such a way where I am humbling myself and getting outside of myself, or am I living for something like money or something related to money?
The logic of heaven and hell, part of it is, if there is no God, if there is no day of judgment, if there is no heaven and no hell, you've got to think, okay, then what is there? And I think it's rather obvious.
So in my circumstance, I know you guys don't know because you're not guarding the gates, but
And how do you have such conviction? Where does that stem from?
Well, we don't know we're right. That's why it's faith. But everybody lives by faith and belief.
Sure.
Even the most ardent scientists live by many rules of faith and belief. I mean, they need constants going into their experiments, right? They're going to believe in those constants. Well, that's faith right there.
Back to the show.
Certainty or proof. There's next to nothing in this life that you can truly prove. That's why we go by the evidence. That's why the militant atheist who says, oh, faith is just, begins where reason leaves off, is completely wrong. There's a faith statement within that they're making because they can't prove what they're saying there. So you can't prove if there is a God and you can't prove if there is no God. But we live by the conviction of how we live, how we think, what our relationships, why is loving at the center of our existence if we've just evolved red in tooth and claw? That doesn't make any sense. There's a spiritual existence. As a mental health therapist, I talk with people endlessly, even if they're atheists, about a spiritual realm. Everybody believes in that now to some extent. So we have convictions, but we don't have proof. But it's back to Jack. I find Jack very interesting when he talked about how he's a good guy. Well, how do you know you're a good guy? People define that differently in every kind of way. But then I love that you said I live by Christian principles. So you're kind of a cultural Christian. And so you're well on your way, even though you're questioning, is Jesus the way, the truth, and the life? So we don't live by certainty, but how do you act? Why do we live by these Christian principles, all of us seemingly?
This might sound stupid, but in terms of proof, what about existence of dinosaurs and showing dinosaur bones and things like this?
That doesn't contradict the Bible at all. The Bible never answers the question, are there dinosaurs? The Bible never answers the question, is North America in real geography?
Yeah, this is now my pet peeve, that they think dinosaurs debunks the Bible. What about dinosaurs? Yeah, that's what I say. What about them? Does the Bible really mention them? They might have some verses that kind of describe a dinosaur, but does it say when the dinosaurs were here or how they came about or how they got extinct or nothing about that? And people are like, oh, you see, that proves dinosaurs are wrong. And now they're going to get into something that's very interesting.
The Bible never answers the question, is there Australia? So you can't argue from silence. When a text is silent, you have to respect the silence of the text. And there's no talking about dinosaurs in the Bible. So therefore, it would be dishonest for me to say, oh, the Bible does say there are dinosaurs, or for somebody else to say the Bible contradicts science, scientific evidence that there is dinosaurs, because the Bible does nothing of the sort.
Now, this is, once again, a common question, but I feel like it needs to be addressed because I still have never heard like a fully satisfactory answer to it. But if you exist your entire life rejecting, and then on the deathbed or for some short period of time, you ask for forgiveness, is that enough to do it? Why or why not?
It's definitely enough to do it, which is a clear symbol of how much God loves you. It's a clear sign that God really wants you to spend eternity with him in heaven. And if you genuinely repent on your deathbed, as the thief who was nailed to the cross on the side of Christ did, he turns to Jesus and says, remember me when you come into your kingdom? And Jesus does not say, well, get down off the cross and say 12 Hail Marys and work in a soup kitchen. Instead, he says, I tell you the truth, today you'll be with me in paradise. You see, that's grace. C.S. Lewis was walking through the faculty lounge at Oxford, and the faculty was having a debate. What's the difference between Christianity and every other major world religion? And C.S. Lewis said, oh, easy, grace. Every major world religion says there's no such thing as a free lunch. Earn it. You pile up the good deeds, and if you pile them up high enough, God will smile on you and you'll be in nirvana or heaven. And Jesus says no. Jesus says heaven is a gift that God gives you, that you don't earn, you don't deserve. It's a gift I offer you through grace.
So if we're born sinners and we have a natural disposition towards sinning and evil, then wouldn't it make sense then, if that is the evidence-based conclusion, to live a life of sin? Because you and I can end up in exactly the same place. How does that justify putting your life towards faith rather than these other things that, maybe biologically speaking are more
That's super disingenuous. Telling someone, yeah, I want to be in relationship with you, but first let me go cheat on you with 10 other people, then we can get together. Like, imagine how disrespectful that would be. That's not true love. That's not true relationship. That's using someone. Let's continue.
Oh, but Jack, as Stuart alluded to beautifully, you're not this wantonly evil guy. You're a really nice guy, based on the evidence that we've seen so far. You can contradict that, but I don't think you will, Jack, okay? So you're a really nice guy, all right? Well, why is that? Because you're created in the image of God. You're not just a dirty, rotten sinner. You're a human being created in the image of God. You have a conscience. You have a rational mind. You have this innate ability to love, to really care. I think you probably have a great friendship with Graham. All right, well, that's part of what it means to be created in the image of God. But you also have a readiness to sin factor, is what Dallas Willard, the USC philosophy professor, called it. You also have a tendency to sin, as I do. We're all mixed up kids. I mean, Jack, when I was a little kid, 50 yards out that door, in a sandbox, I picked up a metal truck and dropped it on the head of a buddy of mine when I was 5 and he was 5.
What?
Well, I'd never seen that behavior modeled, but he offended me. So I picked up the truck and dropped it on him. I'm a dirty, rotten sinner. But I didn't do that consistently. I also shared and was generous. So we're all mixed up kids, I think. And that's one of the reasons I believe in Christ, because that's his analysis of the human dilemma.
Are there certain people, though, that are born evil per se, or is everyone born a sinner in the image of God? They have, sure, the natural disposition towards sinning, but they naturally will, as they grow up and are impressed upon, will develop some sort of ambition and desire for good.
Freud talked about this clearly. As a secular Jew, didn't believe in God, but he said there was an id, ego, superego. And so you were born good in some ways and born with this id, which was tremendously sinful and evil in another way. See, we were just talking about New York City earlier. Look at Nazi Germany. How many thousands upon thousands just fell prey to what Hitler was doing? And they thought, okay, Aryan race kind of makes sense. We're living in fear anyway, and the nationalism is strong. And they just fell prey to, let's wipe out the Jewish race. How many thousands? And they were at the top of the intelligentsia, many of them, in the world. So we were talking about New York City. Do you know how many people just stood by in the subway when that woman was burnt to death by that illegal immigrant? 6. They were just watching right there. I mean, within 10 yards, doing nothing. Or, for example, 1964, Genevieve, the young woman who was to death. That man was seeing her to death right there in New York City, Upper East Side, and all of a sudden, all the lights came on in different buildings. He runs away because he thinks the cops are going to show up. All 38 witnesses in those buildings did not a thing. They didn't come down. They didn't make any calls. And what happens? That man comes back 10 minutes later and just finishes her off. So if you don't think that we have evil in our hearts, that we're not dirty, rotten sinners, I don't know what that is. I don't have a name for it.
Why do you think so many people stand and watch instead of help?
Because we're dirty, rotten sinners. We have that side. We're created in the image of God. We have the ability and potential to do great good. We almost worship each other in a way because you have something in you that I really like. But at the same time, I have this readiness to sin factor where I can do great evil. And I think that ushers in a realm that we call personal, supernatural evil. And if there is no God, that isn't a category. That isn't real. We don't have a name for evil. Evil is innately a religious term.
The person that you brought up, Genevieve, you said? Genevieve?
I think that's, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
so
it.
her life was cut short. Maybe she didn't have the opportunity, like a lot of people have if they exist for long enough, to be introduced to something like that. Or maybe she was introduced, but she was young and she was naive, and so she rejected it. Her life was cut short. She had less opportunity to be able to get through the golden gates. What does something like that mean? Does God know because he's the all-knowing, that if she were to continue on her life, then she would have continually rejected it for the rest of it?
Jack, you're absolutely right. God is all-knowing. That's why I'm real grateful that on the day of judgment, no one's going to be able to trick God, fool God, pull the wool over God's eyes.
That's good.
No, God's all-knowing. God is just, and he will judge justly. That is why I have hope for the future, because I know that ultimately justice will win. Ultimately, evil will lose. But remember, no day of judgment, no heaven, no hell. The good die young. Evil wins often.
What about cats? Because Graham has a cat named Ramsey, and he really loves
And Dog
Ramsey.
Bailey.
And Dog Bailey and Gigi as well. Don't forget
Yeah,
Gigi.
Gigi.
He really loves his pets. Something as simple as that. Are they going to be there?
Well, the lion will lay down with the sheep. We get pretty clearly. And if that's biblical, I think that's more than just metaphorical. I think animals, yes, they're not creating the image of God per se, like we are. So it's a little disturbing to me that 35% of Americans now say that they would save their animal's life before a stranger's
They
life.
said that?
35%.
When did that come
And
out?
it's growing. It came out a few years ago.
Why do
4
you
or 5
think
years
that
ago.
is? Do you think it's a cultural shift? Is it like a individualism, growing in our
It's-
society and people caring for themselves?
It's secularism. Secularism, even though belief in God is growing, at the same time, secularism is growing in different pockets of the nation.
Mhm.
And so when you lose the image of God, if I don't think you're an eternal person who's worth really loving, well, why don't I choose my cat? Especially if I think you're kind of in my way, and especially if I think like, oh, I don't really know you, so why would I have an attachment?
This would be an interesting thought experiment if you had two buttons in front of you. One saves your pet. The other saves a random person that you don't know on the planet. What would you do?
Yep.
Well, I
That's
think that would change it a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't know the person at all and they're so far removed from you that you'll never see them, you're never going to hear from them, but your pet is right there and you could visually see your pet staring at you.
And the Bible would say, morally speaking, you should save the human because a human's life is more valuable than an animal's.
Although I might step on a cockroach, I better not step on you, Jack. Although I might step on an ant,
Yeah.
Graham, I better not step on you. Because you are created in the image of God in the way the cockroach and the ant are not. Now, that does not mean that the cockroach and the ant are insignificant, but it does mean that you are a creation of God in his image, which means you have a value and a dignity that the cockroach and the ant do not have.
Do some people have more value than others? Because if you could rank people higher than dogs, higher than cats, and go down the spectrum, every human is technically the same, even though some people might have a much greater impact on society than others.
But not if there is no God. Because if there is no God, we're the result of evolution, and some of us are evolved higher than others of us. And that's why you had eugenics back at the time of World War II, because certain Aryan races were superior to other races because of evolution. And logically, that makes sense. But the Bible insists, no, you're not just an evolutionary product. You're a human being created in the image of God with innate, intrinsic value and dignity, because you're not simply a highly evolved ape. You're a human being created in the image of God.
When we're debating Hindus,
That's so important to have this conversation, because I think when you see more secularist people will say like, well, what's the difference between saving a cat versus a human? What's the difference between saving someone that I have no idea who it is than saving an animal or a pet that I love? But the thing is, animals not made in the image of God. A person is. They have intrinsic value. But if there is no God, that mindset will start getting ingrained in society when people believe that there's no God. That's the hard part.
College campuses, and Hinduism is growing actually on college campuses. I was frequently pushing them on the caste system because it comes back to your question. I went to the Hindu temple down the street. I was definitely the only Caucasian guy there, but it was quite an experience. And then I went to a Hindu home. And I was sitting with two women, and I said, hold on, don't you have more value than you because you're higher up in the caste system? And they started giggling awkwardly. They said, well, we're kind of doing away with that in Hinduism, but we're trying to figure it out. Because technically, yes, I have more value than you.
Can you explain the caste system?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that.
So the caste system is basically you're born into a certain level of value or not culturally. And so it's a cultural issue that they have set up. So it's not necessarily a type of works. It's not like you work better and do more things and all of a sudden you're higher. No, you're actually born into it.
Is it
so
based
you
on your
can't get out.
Is it based on your family or gender?
exactly.
Or what's it? Okay.
Right.
Reincarnation.
Yeah, reincarnation.
Okay.
Your past karma.
In terms of heaven, do you have a certain image in your mind of what that would look like? Does it differ between you two?
Now, before we go into that, even though you might think it's a bit overhyped, AI is suddenly everywhere, from self-driving cars, molecular medicine, to even business efficiency. If it hasn't hit your industry yet, it's coming. Fast.
But the problem is AI needs a ton of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control?
Well, that's why it's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or our sponsor, OCI. For those unaware, OCI is a blazing fast and secure platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, plus all of your AI.
Do you have a certain image in your mind of what that would look like? Does it differ between you two? Or is there like you said, like we're going to have some sort of physical body, you know, like the classic Hollywood illustration is like clouds everywhere, you know, like big golden gates and that's it. Like, you know, you reunite with your dead great grandpa or something like that.
Yeah. When Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many rooms, and I'm going there to prepare a place for you, that could be metaphorical, or it could be, hey, there literally are homes up there, and this place down here is going to look like a trash can compared to what heaven is really going to look like. But no, the Bible is pretty silent on what specifically it will look like, which I like. I mean, if it's God and God is creating an eternity that is perfect for us, I would guess the Bible would be pretty silent on that because we wouldn't be able to logically grasp it.
So this is
Jack, I do have an image of heaven in my head, and it's wrong.
Okay.
Because the Bible doesn't give us a photograph of heaven, but for the past 2,000 years, followers of Christ have tried to draw that picture. Obviously, Dante tried to do it very clearly in the Divine Comedy and other places. But no, the Bible does not give us a photograph of heaven. And therefore, I have to have the humility to say, I really don't know. But what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 2:9 is, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, mind has not conceived what God has prepared for those who love him.
Yeah, I think it's going to be so wonderful and so mighty and powerful and awesome. No words on earth in an English language could ever describe how wonderful heaven is.
That we'll have resurrection bodies. Heaven is not going to be spirits floating around for eternity. You will be you, I will be me. We will be able to continue to build a friendship, a relationship. We do know there'll be no more evil or suffering, no more fighting, no more war, no more disease, no more death. It'll be eternal joy, but there's no photograph. And I have a problem with people who like to draw the photograph and then say it's a Christian understanding. No, there's no photograph that Jesus or the Bible gives us.
Don't you guys believe that there's a soul and a self that will continue on forever?
I do.
There's got to be, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like there should, because I, first of all, hate the idea that, like, you know, don't exist. But then again, someone said it's basically like, what do you remember before being born?
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, I guess that kind of makes sense and alleviates my fear. But I don't know.
I do find it interesting. I've been so obsessed with like the past life experiences and hearing some of these stories about a kid who comes up and speaks naturally a language that did not exist for the last 5,000 years, isn't taught, and this child speaks it fluidly. Or other stories where you hear where they could recollect a specific memory of a point in time, go back to that and say, I remember this, being like 3 or 4 years old. What are your thoughts on those sort of experiences?
Be skeptical. Be very, very skeptical. Because a lot of them have shown to be totally fraudulent. But second point would be, it maybe is an indicator, a very physical, more tangible type of indicator, that indeed there is an existence after this life. But you've got to be very, very careful, because, I mean, I just heard about a movie that was made of a little boy who had a near-death experience and came back and explained a lot of things. And a movie was made about it, and then, oh, by gollies, turned out to be a fraud.
He's talking about heaven is for real. And the boy came out later after he became a teenager or an adult. He's like, yeah, that I made it up. Apparently, that's what he said.
So you got to be very, very skeptical. You got to demand evidence of reliability before you trust. Otherwise, you'll have your lunch eaten for you.
But there's over 300 peer-reviewed articles at Duke University of near-death experiences that have occurred. That's Duke University.
What are the commonalities that you found from those?
A warm feeling floating outside your body, and clear recollection of things that you saw when you were unconscious, and you're able to read back exactly what was seen, for example, on a medical report. of somebody down the hallway.
Mm-hmm.
And so these, or a boy falling out 12 feet out of a tree was another one who he was able to recollect and tell his mom exactly what occurred later on. And he was fully unconscious. So for me, I was telling somebody who you guys know pretty well, he's pretty big right now. He was pushing me on, hey, Stuart, you keep claiming that all these Muslims are becoming Christians over in the Middle East and Africa. That's ridiculous. And I said, well, hold on a second. Endless amounts of testimony right now, thousands upon thousands. And I have a friend who, once I graduated grad school, he specifically went over there to test this out. And he said, hey, look, man, this is absolutely going on. It's amazing how many of these Muslims who are strong in their faith are giving up land, property, I mean, at the risk of their own lives because they meet Christ in a dream. So these are
Wow.
all testimonies. I think you're probably
Yeah.
more skeptical than I am about them. I used to be very skeptical, but I'm starting to buy into 400 million personal testimonies in India alone talking about supernatural experiences. I mean, do atheists go and question these people?
Yeah, they should, because at the end of the day, there are lots of people, Muslims, having visions of Jesus. Why in the world would they have visions of Jesus? I mean, they know about him, but not as God, not as God's son. So, and then they just abandon their faith and go live for Jesus and become a Christian and give up everything. Because literally, especially in a lot of countries, you get saved and you convert to Christianity, you're not going to have easy life in an Islamic country.
The average atheist does not. And they just say they're all hallucinating or something like that. I'm sorry. There's too many testimonies for me to believe that they're just hallucinating.
So this is from the text, but why did God decide to test humanity again after Jesus' 1,000-year reign with Satan?
But that's a very specific interpretation of some rather vague passages in a highly apocalyptic book called the Book of Revelation, this 1,000-year millennium. All right, so I don't think that I would personally follow that line of thinking that you've just articulated. I think the Bible is pretty clear that Jesus is going to come again one day. He's going to return a second time. But exactly the events surrounding that, when that's going to happen, I think we have to be very, very careful. Because in Matthew 24, Jesus says, no one knows the day or hour of my return, not the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it'll be at the coming of the Son of Man. From the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up till the time Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and swept them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken, the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or hour of my return.
Do you believe certain biblical stories like Noah's Ark occurred exactly as it was written in the Bible?
Yes, I think they did occur exactly as was written in the Bible, but the caveat there is make sure that you interpret fairly.
And where would you say your interpretations of the Bible differ?
I don't know. Where do our interpretations of the Bible differ?
Wow.
Check me if I'm almost being heretical here right now. I would be open to the potential of metaphor as well as mixing with Egyptian creation stories up to Genesis chapter 11. And then all of a sudden you get Abraham. We get all different forms of archaeological evidence with what Abraham did and how the Israelites traveled and the supernatural that occurred. So am I open to the fact that the talking snake may not be actually a snake? Yes, I'm totally open to that. So somebody who pushes me really hard on, well, now you're not taking the Bible.
Well, I like the idea of there was the Babylonians and then the Egyptians. The Egyptians had this idea of how the world began. And I would say Moses like, no. Because he has a good relationship with God. He's able to know how actually the world began. And he's like, you heard it like this, I tell you, no, we were created in the image of God. We didn't come from some gods creating, fighting in the universe or whatever.
You don't believe, for example, that the earth is just 6,000 years old? Come on. You didn't count up the years, Stuart? No, I don't. I think the Bible's silent on how old the earth is. I don't think it's a scientific textbook. So I don't think I'm blowing the Bible to pieces when I say potentially after Genesis chapter 11, that's when the actual literal historical events occurred. Am I wrong on that?
Jesus says, I'm the vine. Is he claiming to be plant life? Jesus says, I'm the door. Is he claiming to be two pieces of plywood slapped together again? Jesus says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Is he calling for self-mutilation? No, 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 no. He's not claiming to be plant life when he says, I'm the vine. He's using metaphor to communicate a truth. I am the source of life. You better be connected to me as a branch is connected to the vine. I am the door. You enter heaven, you enter real life through me, not claiming to be a piece of plywood on hinges. Yes, he calls us to cut off our right hand if our right hand causes you to sin, which does not mean literally cut it off. It means if I want to pick up a gun and blow you away, I better act like I don't have a hand, so I can't pick up the gun. And I better work at knocking guns out of the hands of people who want to murder with a gun, and the same way I want to try and knock Satan out of people's hearts. But it doesn't mean I'm going to go up and knock Graham in the head. No, when I'm speaking metaphorically, I'm going to pray that you do trust in Christ, that you come to belief in God, but I'm not going to hit you on the side of the head.
Why is it so open to different interpretation?
For 2,000 years, the historic Christian church has followed an orthodox faith. So when you talk about 36% of the world being Christian, well, Pew Research, that would be defined as who Jesus was. Did he live, die, teach, and live out that teaching, and then actually rose from the dead? That's who a Christian truly was back then and is today. So, yes, it's at times frustrating, I think, even for us, certain interpretations, for example, of predestination and free will. Why do so many Christians just chew each other up over those issues? Can't it just be clear, God? Mm-hmm. So, yes, that's frustrating. But for 2,000 years, I mean, you go right back to the early monks and what they passed on, or the church fathers, what they passed on, or the eyewitnesses to Jesus himself, what they passed on. It's all been consistent all the way down. It's been crystal.
Yep, that's good. Yeah, there's a lot of different theological arguments, but on the core doctrine, like the Nicene Creed or like the fundamentals of Christianity, believing that Jesus was a real person, believing that he died on the cross and rose again in 3 days, believing in the Trinity, believing the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, we are saved by grace through faith. Like, those are the things that are essential. But there's other things that can be discussed are like third, I forget the word for it, but it's something that, they're important topics, but they're not what saves you, you know? But once you start taking out those core things, that's when it comes down to, you're probably not a Christian.
Clear. But the minors have been difficult and debated over. But that's why St. Augustine himself, the biggest church father who ever existed, said, in the essentials, unity, but in the non-essentials, grace, and bear with each other as you figure these things out. Versus the Zwinglies and the others who said, oh, you don't believe in infant baptism? You believe in believers' baptism? Okay, well, come here, we're going to drown you to death. And that happened oftentimes. So it shows how evil things can get when you say, I have the truth on this minor issue. And if you don't buy into it, then I'm going to kill you for it.
But I think you've asked a great question about communication. All right? When he was a little boy, his room was a disaster area.
It's calling you out.
Okay?
But wow.
Why do I use that word disaster area? Because I want to communicate vividly to you. Instead of me saying, okay, when he was a little boy, the truck was over there. It should have been over here. The bed should have been made this way instead of just thrown together. Instead, I tell you, his room was a disaster area. And in a way, that is an ability I have to communicate more clearly. And you do the same thing. We use hyperbole, we use metaphor, simile, we paint word pictures, and we use language that if you were to take it literally, it would be ridiculous. His room is not literally a disaster area. But we use that kind of language to impress upon a person an image to help them understand the main point. And I can promise you, if you go out and start developing a relationship with a young lady that turns romantic, I think if you keep everything black and white, everything mathematical, that relationship's not going to go too far. To communicate love, to communicate trust is a challenge when it comes to how you communicate that and what type of images do you given to a person for them to mull over.
That's absolutely awesome that they had the conversation and praying for Graham Stephan and Jack, because Jack seems very, very interested. He loves those conversations. And yeah, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, and whoever believes in him will be saved. Whoever believes in him will be saved. So go to Jesus today.